Hello guys! Imagine the greatest empire in the Western world looking east and seeing an invisible wall. Not made of stone, but of sand, wind, and a culture that simply would not bow. Today, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating encounters in history, when Rome, the unbeatable war machine, found its limit in the Mesopotamian desert. You'll discover why Roman legionaries who conquered from Britain to Egypt struggled against mounted archers who seemed to dance across the dunes. Why a battle in 53 BC became the symbol of a frontier that lasted centuries, and why sometimes true power lies in knowing when to stop. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. The dream of an empire without limits. Rome, in the 1st century BC, wasn't just powerful, it was an idea. The idea that the civilized world should be under a single banner protected by Roman eagles. Julius Caesar was conquering Gaul. Pompey had pacified the eastern Mediterranean. And Marcus Licinius Crassus? Well, he wanted his own glory. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. So rich that he financed armies, bought political favors, and yet still felt something was missing: military prestige. Caesar had Gaul, Pompey had the East. Him? He needed an epic conquest, and there it was, right on Rome's eastern frontier, the Parthian Empire. Mysterious, rich in gold and silk from the Silk Road, and with a reputation for being different. They weren't like the Gauls or the Greeks. The Parthians were descendants of steppe nomads, heirs to tactics that came from the infinite plains of Central Asia. Crassus looked at the map and saw opportunity. The Roman Senate, with some hesitation, agreed. After all, expansion was what Rome did best. Or was it? Mesopotamia was a land of contrasts that defied logic. On one side, mighty rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, cut through fertile valleys where civilizations were born millennia before. On the other, the desert stretched like an ocean of sand where midday heat could fry an egg and the night cold froze your bones. Imagine the sensation: the sun beating relentlessly on bronze armor, sweat running down the legionaries' backs, sand getting into sandals, crunching between toes. The wind carried the dry smell of earth, mixed with the odor of horses and dust. And on the horizon, nothing. Just more desert, rippling in mirages that played with the mind. Rome was an infantry powerhouse. Its legions were disciplined machines, trained to fight in formation, advance like a wall of shields, plant spears, and dominate any enemy that stood still long enough to be crushed. But the Parthians? They didn't stand still. The Parthians were masters of cavalry warfare, mounted archers who could shoot arrows while galloping, turn their backs to the enemy, and still in flight, shoot backwards with deadly precision. They called it the Parthian shot. It was a lethal dance that left the Romans dizzy. And there was something else: the cataphracts. Heavily armored knights, covered head to toe in metal scale armor, riding equally protected horses. They were like war tanks before tanks existed. When they charged, the ground trembled. But Crassus didn't fully understand this. He saw the desert as a geographical obstacle, not as a weapon. He saw the Parthians as just another enemy to be defeated by Roman superiority. And so in 53 BC he marched east with 7 legions, about 40,000 men, confident that history would remember him as the conqueror of Persia. What he didn't know was that he was about to star in one of the most studied, most analyzed, most symbolic defeats in military history. A defeat that wasn't just about tactics or numbers, but about cultures colliding on terrain that favored only one of them. And perhaps the most curious thing is this: he didn't even need to be there. There was no immediate Parthian threat, no insult to Rome. It was pure ambition, and the desert, as if it were a silent judge, was waiting. If you're enjoying this journey, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Comment where you're watching from. The march was about to begin, and with it, a lesson that would echo through the centuries. Not every territory can be conquered with force alone. Sometimes geography, climate, and local culture form a wall stronger than any stone fortification. Rome was about to discover this the hard way. The march into the unknown. The campaign began with optimism. After all, these were the Roman legions, veterans who had marched through Gaul, Hispania, the mountains of Macedonia. The desert would be just another obstacle. Or at least that's what Crassus thought. He had a local guide, an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes, who knew the region like the back of his hand. Ariamnes suggested a route. Follow along the Euphrates River, where there was abundant water, allied cities, and shade from palm trees. A longer march, yes, but safe. Strategic. Crassus listened and decided to ignore it. Why? Well, he was in a hurry. He wanted quick glory. And he had information, or thought he had, that the Parthian army was fragmented, far away, unprepared. Cutting straight through the desert would save weeks. It would be a demonstration of Roman boldness, an audacious strike. Except the desert doesn't negotiate with audacity. Imagine the scene, 40,000 men marching in endless columns, raising clouds of dust that mixed with the pale blue sky. The rhythmic sound of sandals hitting the sand, the clinking of armor, the creaking of carts carrying provisions. And the sun. Always the sun. In Mesopotamia, summer heat isn't just uncomfortable, it's oppressive. The kind of heat that dries your throat in minutes, that makes skin burn even under fabric, that turns metal armor into a walking furnace. The legionaries, accustomed to the Mediterranean climate, felt each step as a small torture. The rationed water tasted like old leather. Sand got into everything, eyes, mouth, ears. And the horizon, always the same, flat, empty, no sign of enemy, no sign of relief. Did Crassus begin to doubt at this moment? Hard to know, but his officers did. Gaius Cassius Longinus, one of his commanders, questioned the route. Publius, Crassus's son, a brilliant young man who had served under Caesar, also expressed concern, but Crassus was the general. And generals don't turn back. It's curious how leadership decisions work, isn't it? Sometimes admitting a mistake would be seen as weakness, and so pride, that human, universal thing, pushes people forward, even when intuition screams to stop. While the Romans marched, the Parthians watched, not with desperation or fear, but with the patience of those who know the terrain. The Parthian commander, a noble named Serene, was young, only 30 years old, but he was a military genius. Serene understood something fundamental. You didn't need to destroy the enemy immediately. You needed to exhaust it. Let the desert do half the work. Wait for the right moment. He had under his command about 10,000 cavalry. Seems small compared to 40,000 Romans, right? But numbers don't tell the whole story. Serene had mobility. He had archers who could shoot hundreds of arrows without needing to stop. And he had something the Romans didn't expect, camel caravans carrying infinite reserves of arrows. Imagine the preparation, tents being set up in the shade of distant dunes, horses drinking water from hidden wells, archers checking their bowstrings, adjusting their arrowheads, all done in silence, far from Roman eyes. A war dance being choreographed for days. The Romans, meanwhile, kept marching, tired, thirsty, still confident that numerical superiority would guarantee victory when the confrontation finally happened. But the confrontation wouldn't be as they imagined. At night, when the temperature dropped and the cold cut through skin, the legionaries wrapped themselves in their cloaks and looked at the starry sky. Perhaps some thought of home, of Rome, of the promises of wealth and land that Crassus had made. Others, the more experienced ones, perhaps felt that chill down the spine that every veteran soldier recognizes, the premonition that something was wrong, and they were right. There's something fascinating about terrestrial empires. They depend on logistics. Rome was a master at this. Paved roads, strategically positioned forts, well-protected supply lines. It was like a well-oiled machine. But here, there were no roads, no forts, no supply lines. There was only sand, heat, and the vague promise that somewhere ahead there would be water and victory. The Parthians, on the other hand, had grown up in this environment. For them, the desert wasn't an obstacle, it was an ally. Their horses were smaller, more resilient, raised on the steppes. Their warriors knew where to find water, how to navigate the dunes, how to use the wind to their advantage. It's almost poetic, if you think about it. Two empires, two completely different styles of war, about to collide on terrain that totally favored one of them. Rome, with its heavy infantry and rigid discipline. Parthia, with its light cavalry and lethal flexibility. Who do you think had better chances? The answer was just days away. In a place called Carrhae, a small town in the middle of nowhere that would soon become synonymous with disaster. Crassus and his legions kept marching, with each step, closer to an encounter that would change how Rome saw the East. And that would teach a brutal lesson. Sometimes, conquest isn't a matter of strength, but of understanding where you are. The desert was silent, but not for long. The first contact. But the morning of May the 9th, 53 BC began like the others. Clear sky, rising heat, and the monotonous sound of marching. The Roman legions were approaching Carrhae, a city that marked the border between Roman-controlled territory and Parthian lands. Crassus must have felt relief. Finally, civilization, fresh water, perhaps even favorable news. And then they appeared, not with the dramatic thunder of an army marching in formation, not with war cries or fluttering banners. The Parthians emerged from the horizon like mirages taking shape, silent horsemen moving in fluid waves across distant dunes. The Romans formed their lines. It was an automatic procedure, practiced 1,000 times. The testudo, the famous Roman tortoise, the shields interlocked, forming a mobile wall of protection. Impenetrable against spears, effective against heavy cavalry charges, a human fortress. But the Parthians didn't charge, they circled, like wolves around prey, keeping distance, studying, waiting. And then, without warning, the air filled with arrows. Imagine the sound, a sharp whistle, multiplied by hundreds, like a swarm of angry wasps cutting through the air. The arrows fell in perfect arcs, finding spaces between shields, piercing unprotected shoulders, hitting legs, arms, necks. These weren't ordinary arrows. They were long, heavy, designed to pierce armor. The legionaries cowered under their shields. The testudo formation worked, but it had a problem. You can't move fast when you're covered, and you definitely can't counterattack. Crassus ordered an advance. The legions moved forward, disciplined, maintaining formation. They needed to reach the archers, engage them in hand-to-hand combat where Roman superiority would be decisive. But the Parthians simply retreated. They turned their horses with an almost dancing grace and moved away, always maintaining the perfect distance, far enough to be safe, close enough to keep shooting, and they kept shooting. It's frustrating, isn't it? Imagine training your whole life for one type of war. Formation, discipline, brute force. And suddenly facing something completely different. Like trying to punch the wind. The innovation that changed everything. There's a technical detail here that's fascinating. Normally, mounted archers had a problem. They carried a limited number of arrows. Eventually, they'd run out of ammunition and need to retreat. Serene solved this problem with pure genius. He brought camel caravans, hundreds of them, loaded exclusively with arrows. When an archer emptied his quiver, he simply rode to the camels, reloaded, and returned to the fight. It was a mobile supply line, a walking factory of death. The Romans expected the arrow storm to eventually diminish. They endured, they held, they maintained formation, and then they realized the arrows weren't diminishing. If anything, they were increasing. Morale began to crack. Wounded men groaned under shields. The sun remained relentless, thirst was torturous, and the enemy, untouchable, dancing at the edges of vision, always shooting, always moving. Crassus was in a trap. If he stayed still, his troops would be slowly torn apart. If he advanced, the Parthians would simply retreat, maintaining distance and continuing the distant massacre. If he retreated, well, that would completely demoralize the legions, so he made a desperate decision. Publius, his son, was young, brave, and commanded the Roman cavalry, about 1,300 Gallic horsemen who had served under Caesar. Crassus ordered him to take this force, break the Parthian line, and create an opening for the rest of the army to advance. Publius obeyed. After all, he was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders even when every instinct screams that something is wrong. He led his cavalry in a furious charge. The Gauls were fierce warriors, mounted on powerful horses armed with long spears. They crossed the plain like lightning, directly toward Parthian lines, and the Parthians retreated, exactly as expected. Publius pursued them, certain he was gaining ground, certain he had finally forced the enemy to flee. He didn't realize he was being drawn away from the main army, didn't realize the flight was choreographed, didn't realize until it was too late. When Publius finally stopped, looked around, and saw he was surrounded. Completely. The Parthian archers he thought were fleeing now formed a circle around him. And behind them, emerging like metal ghosts, came the cataphracts. These heavy horsemen, who until now had remained hidden, charged. The sound was like thunder over sand. The Gallic cavalry, exhausted from the pursuit, tried to resist, but they were outnumbered, isolated, and without hope. I won't describe what happened in graphic detail because it's not necessary. Suffice to say it was quick and decisive. Publius fought bravely to the end. When it became clear there was no way out, he ordered one of his men to kill him quickly, preferring that to capture. And then, in an act of calculated psychological cruelty, Serene did something that broke the Roman spirit more than any arrow could. He impaled Publius's head on a spear and rode back to where Crassus's main army was waiting, surrounded, agonizing, and paraded with it in front of the legions. Crassus saw, and something inside him broke. Can you imagine? Seeing your son, the hope of the future, the redemption of the entire campaign, reduced to a macabre trophy in enemy hands. It's the kind of trauma there's no coming back from. Night fell over Carrhae. What remained of the Roman legions huddled in a precarious defensive formation, wounded, demoralized, surrounded. The desert around was silent, but they knew the Parthians were there, waiting for dawn to finish the job. And Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the man who dreamed of eternal glory, sat in the midst of the disaster he himself had created, understanding too late that some borders should not be crossed. The first contact, the morning of May 9th, 53 BC, began like the others. Clear sky, rising heat, and the monotonous sound of marching. The Roman legions were approaching Carrhae, a city that marked the border between Roman-controlled territory and Parthian lands. Crassus must have felt relief. Finally, civilization. Fresh water, perhaps even favorable news. and then they appeared. Not with the dramatic thunder of an army marching in formation, not with war cries or fluttering banners. The Parthians emerged from the horizon like mirages taking shape. Silent horsemen moving in fluid waves across distant dunes. The Romans formed their lines. It was an automatic procedure, practiced 1,000 times. The testudo, the famous Roman tortoise, where shields interlocked, forming a mobile wall of protection. Impenetrable against spears, effective against heavy cavalry charges, a human fortress. But the Parthians didn't charge, they circled, like wolves around prey, keeping distance, studying, waiting. And then, without warning, the air filled with arrows. Imagine the sound, a sharp whistle, multiplied by hundreds, like a swarm of angry wasps cutting through the air. The arrows fell in perfect arcs, finding spaces between shields, piercing unprotected shoulders, hitting legs, arms, necks. These weren't ordinary arrows, they were long, heavy, designed to pierce armor. The legionaries cowered under their shields. The testudo formation worked, but it had a problem. You can't move fast when you're covered, and you definitely can't counterattack. Crassus ordered an advance. The legions moved forward, disciplined, maintaining formation. They needed to reach the archers, engage them in hand-to-hand combat where Roman superiority would be decisive. But the Parthians simply retreated. They turned their horses with an almost dancing grace and moved away, always maintaining the perfect distance, far enough to be safe, close enough to keep shooting, and they kept shooting. It's frustrating, isn't it? Imagine training your whole life for one type of war. Formation, discipline, brute force, and suddenly facing something completely different. Like trying to punch the wind. The innovation that changed everything. There's a technical detail here that's fascinating. Normally, mounted archers had a problem. They carried a limited number of arrows. Eventually, they'd run out of ammunition and need to retreat. Serene solved this problem with pure genius. He brought camel caravans, hundreds of them, loaded exclusively with arrows. When an archer emptied his quiver, he simply rode to the camels, reloaded, and returned to the fight. It was a mobile supply line, a walking factory of death. The Romans expected the arrow storm to eventually diminish. They endured, they held, they maintained formation. And then they realized the arrows weren't diminishing. If anything, they were increasing. Morale began to crack. Wounded men groaned under shields. The sun remained relentless. Thirst was torturous. And the enemy? Untouchable, dancing at the edges of vision, always shooting, always moving. Crassus was in a trap. If he stayed still, his troops would be slowly torn apart. If he advanced, the Parthians would simply retreat, maintaining distance and continuing the distant massacre. If he retreated, well, that would completely demoralize the legions, so he made a desperate decision. Publius, his son, was young, brave, and commanded the Roman cavalry, about 1,300 Gallic horsemen who had served under Caesar. Crassus ordered him to take this force, break the Parthian line, and create an opening for the rest of the army to advance. Publius obeyed. After all, he was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders even when every instinct screams that something is wrong. He led his cavalry in a furious charge. The Gauls were fierce warriors, mounted on powerful horses, armed with long spears. They crossed the plain like lightning, directly toward Parthian lines. And the Parthians retreated, exactly as expected. Publius pursued them, certain he was gaining ground, certain he had finally forced the enemy to flee. He didn't realize he was being drawn away from the main army, didn't realize the flight was choreographed, didn't realize until it was too late. When Publius finally stopped, looked around, and saw he was surrounded. Completely. The Parthian archers he thought were fleeing now formed a circle around him. And behind them, emerging like metal ghosts, came the cataphracts. These heavy horsemen, who until now had remained hidden, charged. The sound was like thunder over sand. The Gallic cavalry, exhausted from the pursuit, tried to resist. But they were outnumbered, isolated, and without hope. I won't describe what happened in graphic detail because it's not necessary. Suffice to say it was quick and decisive. Publius fought bravely to the end. When it became clear there was no way out, he ordered one of his men to kill him quickly, preferring that to capture. And then, in an act of calculated psychological cruelty, Serene did something that broke the Roman spirit more than any arrow could. He impaled Publius's head on a spear and rode back to where Crassus's main army was waiting, surrounded, agonizing, and paraded with it in front of the legions. Crassus saw, and something inside him broke. Can you imagine? Seeing your son, the hope of the future, the redemption of the entire campaign, reduced to a macabre trophy in enemy hands? It's the kind of trauma there's no coming back from. Night fell over Carrhae. What remained of the Roman legions huddled in a precarious defensive formation, wounded, demoralized, surrounded. The desert around was silent, but they knew the Parthians were there, waiting for dawn to finish the job. And Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the man who dreamed of eternal glory, sat in the midst of the disaster he himself had created, understanding too late that some borders should not be crossed. The impossible retreat. Night in the desert can be strangely peaceful. The suffocating heat gives way to a cutting cold. The sky fills with stars so bright they seem close enough to touch. The silence is profound, broken only by the gentle wind whispering between the dunes. But for the Romans huddled in Carrhae that night, there was no peace. Only the groaning of the wounded, the metallic smell of blood mixed with sand, and the crushing weight of imminent defeat. Crassus was in shock. Contemporary witnesses describe a transformed man, no longer the confident general, but someone consumed by guilt and grief. He barely spoke. His officers tried to organize some kind of plan, but leadership had disappeared along with hope. Gaius Cassius Longinus, one of the most experienced commanders, took control. He knew that staying there meant complete annihilation at dawn. The only chance, however small, was a nighttime retreat, escape under the cloak of darkness before the Parthians realized it was risky, moving a wounded, demoralized and exhausted army through the desert at night. The chances of dispersion, of men getting lost, of panic spreading, were enormous, but staying wasn't an option. So they moved, in absolute silence, abandoning lit fires to create the illusion that the camp was still occupied, leaving behind the most seriously wounded, a brutal but necessary decision. Those men knew what it meant. Some begged not to be abandoned, others accepted silently, perhaps relieved that suffering would soon end. It's hard to judge these wartime decisions, isn't it? Sitting comfortably centuries later, it's easy to say what should have been done. But there, in that moment, with the weight of survival on their backs, choices become impossible. The Roman column dragged through the darkness. Every sound seemed amplified. The clinking of armor, a rolling stone, a muffled cough. Everyone expected that at any moment a rain of arrows would come from the darkness. But it didn't. They managed to reach a nearby town called Seneca before dawn. For a brief moment, there must have been relief. Walls, protection, a pause in the nightmare. But Serene wasn't the type to let prey escape. At dawn, the Parthians appeared again. They surrounded Seneca, and Serene, demonstrating a deep understanding of military psychology, sent a message to Crassus. It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. He proposed peace negotiations, said he had no interest in massacring what remained of the Roman army. That honor had already been satisfied, that Crassus could withdraw his troops safely if he agreed to certain terms. Sounds generous, right? Almost civilized. But there was a condition. Crassus needed to go personally, accompanied by only a few officers, to discuss terms. The Roman officers were immediately suspicious. It was too obvious, a transparent trap. They advised Crassus to refuse, to find another way out, to resist inside the city until perhaps reinforcements arrived. But Crassus was broken, physically and mentally exhausted. Perhaps he genuinely believed there was no other option. Or maybe, and this is speculation but human, he simply didn't care anymore. The guilt over his son's death, over the destruction of 7 legions, over the monumental disaster his ambition had caused, perhaps it was too heavy to carry. He agreed to go. Accompanied by a small group of officers, Crassus left the walls of Seneca and went to meet Surena. The meeting began formally, almost cordially, but it quickly degenerated. There are conflicting versions of what exactly happened, whether it was a premeditated ambush or if tensions simply exploded. What we know is this. One of the Roman officers tried to pull Crassus away from the situation. The Parthian guards interpreted it as aggression. Swords were drawn, and in a matter of seconds Crassus and his officers were dead. There was no prolonged torture, no public execution. It was quick and chaotic. But the result was the same. The richest man in Rome, who dreamed of triumphs and statues, lay dead in the sand of a place few Romans even knew existed. They say, though this may be propaganda, that Surena ordered molten gold to be poured into Crassus's mouth after death. A symbol, a message about greed and ambition. Truth or legend, the image stuck and became part of history. The final cost of the 40,000 men who marched east with Crassus, only about 10,000 managed to return to Roman territory. Half the army was dead, the other 10,000 captured, taken as prisoners to the east, to the heart of the Parthian Empire, where they would spend the rest of their lives far from home. There are historical records, fascinating and sad, that some of these Roman prisoners were settled in remote colonies on the eastern frontier of Parthia, near present-day China. They married local women, had children, and gradually integrated. Roman legionaries who became Asian farmers, their eagles traded for plows, their stories of glory transformed into distant memories. Did they think about Rome? Did they, when looking at the night sky, recognize the same stars that shone over the Forum? Did they tell their children about the marble city that ruled the Western world, knowing they would never see it again? These are unanswered questions. But they remind us that behind every military statistic, every casualty number, there are individual lives, men with families, dreams, fears. In Rome, news of the defeat fell like lightning. The Senate panicked. Julius Caesar, who would soon become the most powerful man in Rome, must have absorbed the lesson. The East was different. Persia would not be conquered as easily as Gaul. And so a border was established, not by diplomatic agreement, but by brutal reality. The Euphrates River became, in fact, the eastern limit of Roman power, and it would remain so for centuries. Carrhae entered history alongside Cannae and Teutoburg. Defeats so catastrophic they shaped Roman strategy for generations. But it had something unique. It wasn't a surprise ambush. It wasn't enemy numerical superiority. It was simply the collision of two military worlds on terrain that completely favored one of them. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: power is not absolute. It's contextual. Rome was unbeatable in certain scenarios, but in the Mesopotamian desert, against an enemy that understood mobility and patience, all that discipline, all that training, all that confidence simply wasn't enough. The desert returned to silence. The sands eventually covered the bones. And the invisible border remained, a permanent reminder that some limits are imposed not by walls, but by the very nature of reality. Why Rome never conquered Persia? Carrhae should have been an aberration, an accident, a poorly planned campaign led by a general motivated by personal vanity. Rome had recovered from defeats before, Cannae against Hannibal, for example, and come back stronger. So why, after Carrhae, did Rome never really conquer Persia? Why did this eastern frontier remain fluid, contested, but never truly broken? The answer isn't simple. It's not just a military question. It's about geography, culture, economy, and the very nature of how empires work. Let's start with the obvious, geography. Rome was a Mediterranean power. All its infrastructure, roads, ports, forts, was built around the Mediterranean Sea. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, and with good reason. Controlling the Mediterranean meant controlling trade routes, fast communications, and troop mobility. But Persia? Persia was continental. Its heart was in the mountains of the Iranian plateau, in the steppes of Central Asia, in the deserts of Mesopotamia. Places where Roman ships couldn't reach, where paved roads ended and gave way to caravan trails. For Rome to conquer Persia, it would need to project land power across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain, maintaining absurdly long supply lines, and against an enemy that knew exactly how to exploit that kind of weakness. It's like trying to use a perfect tool for the wrong job, you know? Rome was an incredible hammer, but Persia wasn't a nail. Carrhae wasn't the end of Roman ambitions in the east. Far from it. Several emperors tried. Some even had temporary successes. Mark Antony, Cleopatra's famous lover, launched a massive invasion of Parthia in 36 BC. He had learned from Crassus's mistakes, or at least thought he had. He brought an even larger army, better equipped, with more cavalry. And yet it was a disaster. Not as catastrophic as Carrhae, but an expensive failure. Parthian tactics, harass, retreat, exhaust, worked again. Mark Antony lost thousands of men and returned home empty-handed. Trajan, in the 2nd century AD, was more successful. He actually conquered Mesopotamia temporarily, reaching the Persian Gulf. Rome had never extended so far east. It must have seemed that finally, after almost 2 centuries, the ghost of Carrhae was being exorcised. But it didn't last. Revolts broke out in the newly conquered lands. Supply lines proved impossible to maintain, and when Trajan died, his successor, Hadrian, immediately abandoned the conquests. Not out of weakness, but pragmatism. He understood what many before him hadn't. Some conquests cost more to maintain than they're worth, and that's a fascinating lesson, isn't it? In the modern world, we still see this. Military victories that become strategic traps. Territories that are easy to conquer but impossible to control. But it wasn't just geography. There was something deeper at play, cultural and political differences that made Persian integration into the Roman world extremely difficult. Rome had a model of conquest that worked well in the Mediterranean. Conquer, Romanize, integrate. Local elites were co-opted, received Roman citizenship. Their children were educated in Rome. In 1 or 2 generations, the conquered province would become genuinely Roman. This worked in Gaul, in Hispania, in North Africa, in Greece, even in Britain eventually. But Persia was different. It had its own ancient civilization, as old as the Greek, as sophisticated as the Roman. It had its own religion, Zoroastrianism, which was deeply rooted in Persian identity. It had its own literary language, its own systems of government, its own imperial traditions. The Persians didn't see themselves as barbarians waiting to be civilized by Rome. They saw themselves as equals, perhaps even superior in some aspects. And people who see themselves that way aren't easily assimilated. It's almost like trying to mix oil and water. It's not that one is better than the other. They're simply incompatible at certain fundamental levels. And then there's the question of pure military power. Parthia, and later the Sassanid Empire that replaced it, was a superpower in its own right. It wasn't a barbarian tribe that could be crushed in one or two decisive battles. They had resources, they had advanced military technology, they had a warrior tradition dating back to the Achaemenid Persians of Cyrus and Darius, and, crucially, they had geography on their side. Whenever Rome pushed east, the Persians could retreat to their mountainous heartland, regroup, and counterattack. And whenever the Persians pushed west, Rome did the same, retreating to its fortresses in Syria and Anatolia. The result? Centuries of intermittent war, but no decisive victory for either side. A border that moved back and forth like a tide, but that fundamentally remained stable. It was frustrating for both sides, but it was also, in a way, a natural balance. Two empires, roughly equivalent in power, separated by a zone of challenging geography, reaching an involuntary stalemate. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Comment what you think about this rivalry between empires. There's something deeply human in this whole story. Crassus's ambition wasn't unique, it was universal, the desire for glory, to be remembered, to achieve something great. How many of us don't feel that on some level? But the tragedy of Carrhae reminds us that ambition without wisdom is dangerous, that ignoring advice, ignoring the reality of terrain, ignoring practical limitations in favor of grandiose dreams, that leads to disaster. Rome eventually learned this lesson. Not completely, emperors still tried to conquer Persia from time to time, but sufficiently. The eastern frontier was fortified, garrisoned, but not aggressively pushed eastward, and perhaps there's wisdom in that. Knowing your limits. Understanding that power doesn't mean unlimited capability. That even the strongest empire in the world has frontiers beyond which it cannot go sustainably. The Euphrates became more than a river. It became a symbol, the line between what Rome could control and what was beyond its reach. And for centuries, that line held, not for lack of trying, but from gradual recognition of reality. And the reality was simple. Persia would not be conquered. Not because Rome wasn't strong enough in absolute terms, but because the kind of strength Rome had wasn't suited to the kind of challenge Persia presented. It's a lesson that echoes through history. Brute force isn't enough. You need the right strategy, the right terrain, the right context. Otherwise, you become just another cautionary tale buried in the sands of time. The even more powerful successor. In the year 224 AD, something changed in the east. The Parthian Empire, which had been Rome's rival for almost 3 centuries, fell. Not to Rome, but to an internal force, a Persian dynasty that had grown in the shadows, waiting for its moment. They called themselves Sassanids, and they were different. The Parthians were, in essence, a confederation of semi-independent nobles. Their king was more a first among equals than an absolute monarch. This gave flexibility but also weakness. Internal disputes were constant. Unity was always precarious. The Sassanids changed that. They centralized power, created an efficient bureaucracy, reorganized the army, and, perhaps most importantly, embraced Zoroastrianism not just as religion, but as state ideology. They saw themselves as the true heirs of the ancient Achaemenid Persians, the Persians of Cyrus, of Darius, of Xerxes, and they looked west toward Rome with a mixture of contempt and ambition. Rome at this time was changing too. The 3rd century AD was chaotic. Emperors assassinated, civil wars, borders under constant pressure from Germanic tribes to the north and Persians to the east. The old order was cracking, and the Sassanids saw the opportunity. Shapur-Pai, the 2nd Sassanid king, wasn't just a conqueror, he was a brilliant strategist. He launched deep campaigns into Roman territory, capturing cities in Syria and Anatolia. And in 260 AD, he achieved something no Persian leader had done before, or would do after. He captured a living Roman emperor. Valerian, emperor of Rome, was defeated and captured at the Battle of Edessa. Imagine the humiliation. The leader of the Western world, the man who sat on the throne of Augustus and Trajan, now a prisoner of a Persian king. Shapur didn't kill him immediately. They say he kept him as a living trophy, using him as a footstool when mounting his horse. It's a story that may be exaggerated, Persian propaganda perhaps, but the central fact remains. Rome had suffered one of the greatest humiliations in its history, and curiously, this forced Rome to adapt. The Roman Empire of the 4th and 5th centuries AD was different from Crassus's empire. More defensive, more aware of its limitations, but also more resilient. They fortified the eastern frontier with a series of massive fortresses, created heavy cavalry units to counter Persian cataphracts, learned to play the Persian game instead of just imposing the Roman style of war, and it worked, more or less. The border stabilized again, not through peace, but through carefully maintained balance of power. There was something almost ritualistic about the Roman-Persian wars of the following centuries. Rome invaded Mesopotamia. Persia counterattacked in Syria. Peace treaties were signed. 10 years later, war resumed. And so on, like a deadly dance that both sides knew by heart. It's fascinating to think about. 2 empires spending enormous amounts of wealth and human lives, fighting over territories that neither could really hold long term, as if they were trapped in a pattern they couldn't, or wouldn't, break. Why? Well, part was prestige. Neither side could appear weak. Part was strategic. Controlling Mesopotamia meant controlling valuable trade routes. And part was simply inertia. Sometimes wars continue not because they make sense, but because they always have. In the 6th century AD, under Roman Emperor Justinian and Persian King Khosrow I, the rivalry reached new levels of sophistication and absurdity. They fought, negotiated, fought again, signed an eternal peace that lasted 7 years, and then fought once more. Khosrow was a fascinating ruler, brilliant, cultured, interested in philosophy and science. He even gave refuge to Greek philosophers who fled the Byzantine Empire when their schools were closed. There was mutual respect, almost admiration between Persian and Roman elites, even as their armies massacred each other at the borders. Did they realize the futility? Did they, in their private moments, leaders on both sides, look at maps and wonder why they kept repeating the same cycle? Or were they so trapped in their imperial identities that they simply couldn't imagine another way of existing? The final war between Rome and Persia began in 602 AD and lasted until 628 AD. It was the most devastating of all. Both empires completely exhausted themselves. Cities were burned. Populations were displaced, imperial treasuries were emptied, and in the end, they returned essentially to pre-war borders, 26 years of destruction for nothing. But the real result of this war wasn't felt immediately. It was felt a decade later when a new power emerged from the sands of Arabia, a power that neither Rome nor Persia were prepared to face. A power that within decades would sweep both empires from the region and completely redraw the Middle Eastern map. Islam was coming, and both the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid, exhausted from centuries of mutual struggle, simply didn't have the strength to resist. In 636 AD, at the Battle of Yarmouk, Muslim Arab armies destroyed a large Byzantine force. In 642 AD, at the Battle of Nahavand, they did the same with the Persians. The Sassanid Empire collapsed within a decade. Rome lost its eastern provinces forever. The border that had defined the world for centuries, the line between Rome and Persia, between West and East, disappeared. And a new world order was born. It's ironic, isn't it? Two titans so focused on destroying each other that they didn't notice the real threat coming from a completely different direction. So invested in their ancient rivalry that they became blind to the changing world around them. And perhaps there's a lesson there about how ancient conflicts can consume so much energy that they leave you vulnerable to new challenges, about how empires can be so trapped in their narratives that they lose the ability to adapt, about how sometimes the real enemy isn't the obvious rival, but the inability to see beyond it. The lessons of geography and power. There's something hypnotic about looking at ancient maps. The lines drawn on parchment, the borders sketched with faded ink, the names of places that no longer exist. And if you look at a map of the Roman world at its height, one thing becomes clear: there's a shape, a logic. The Roman Empire wasn't random. It was almost perfectly adapted to Mediterranean geography. All its provinces touched the sea or were connected to it by navigable rivers. The Rhine, the Danube, the Nile all served as arteries of communication and trade. Now look at Persia. Its heart was far from the sea, in the Zagros Mountains, on the arid plateaus of Iran, in the infinite steppes that stretched east to Central Asia. It was a terrestrial empire built on caravan routes and horses, not on ships and ports. These weren't just geographical differences. They were fundamental differences in how power was projected, maintained, and defended. For Rome, expanding meant following the sea. Conquer Gaul, sail the Mediterranean to Massilia, then march north. Conquer Egypt, sail directly to Alexandria. Conquer Britain, cross the English Channel with invasion fleets, but conquer Persia. That meant marching hundreds of kilometers through deserts and mountains, far from any naval support, depending entirely on vulnerable terrestrial supply lines, and against an enemy that was master at cutting exactly those lines. It's as if nature had drawn an invisible border, a natural limit where one type of empire ended and another began. Think about water. For Rome, water meant power. The Mediterranean was a highway. You could move an entire legion from Rome to Syria faster by ship than marching overland, could send messages, supplies, reinforcements with relative ease. But in the interior of Mesopotamia, in the Syrian desert, on the Iranian plateau, water was scarcity. It was the most precious resource. Armies didn't move along efficient routes, but from oasis to oasis, from well to well. And whoever controlled those water points controlled movement. The Persians knew this intimately. They had lived in these lands for millennia, knew where every spring was, knew every path through the mountains, and could, with cruel ease, poison wells, divert rivers, transform the very land into a weapon. Rome could bring all its military might, all its legendary discipline, all its technical ingenuity. But if soldiers were dying of thirst before even seeing the enemy, what good was it? And then there's the question of distances. From Rome to the eastern frontier, say Syria, was about 3,000 kilometers. That was already far. But from there to the heart of Persia, another 2,500 to 2,000 kilometers through much more difficult terrain. Imagine commanding an empire where messages take months to go and return, where a crisis on the frontier can be resolved or transformed into complete catastrophe before Rome even knows it exists. where local governors have to make crucial decisions without consulting the capital, simply because there's no time. That kind of distance wasn't just logistical, it was political. It made centralized control, which was Rome's strength, almost impossible. And the Persians? They were used to it. Their model of government was always more decentralized. Satraps, provincial governors, had enormous autonomy. Since the times of Darius, the Persians had developed systems to govern vast distances without needing minute-to-minute control. It was an evolutionary adaptation. An empire shaped by its geography, just as Rome had been shaped by its own. Now think about altitude. Much of Persian territory was on high plateaus. The Iranian plateau has an average altitude of 1,200 meters. It's thin air, extreme climate, freezing winters, scalding summers. Armies coming from Mediterranean plains suffered, not just from the climate difference, but from the simple physics of breathing and moving at high altitudes without acclimatization. Persian troops, they lived there, were adapted. It was their home, and there are the mountains. The Zagros Mountains are a massive natural barrier, peaks reaching 4,000 meters, deep valleys, narrow passes that could be defended by small forces against much larger armies. The Greeks learned this when Leonidas and his 300 Spartans held the Persian army at Thermopylae. But the principle works both ways. For Rome to advance deep into Persia, it would have to force passages through these mountains. And each pass was a potential trap, a place where numerical superiority meant little and local knowledge meant everything. Did Roman generals, sitting in their command tents, look at maps and feel the weight of these realities? Did they realize it wasn't lack of courage or skill, but simply the cold physics of geography? Or was imperial ideology, the belief that Rome was destined to rule the world, so strong that it clouded practical judgment? There are historical records of debates in the Roman Senate about the Parthian question and later the Persian question. Some senators argued for total conquest, others for strategic containment. The wisest suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, some borders should be accepted rather than challenged. But wisdom in politics is rare, especially when military glory brings so much prestige. And so generation after generation of Roman soldiers marched east. Some returned victorious, many returned defeated, and some, like Crassus's men, never returned at all. Meanwhile, the frontier remained, not because one side was stronger than the other in absolute terms, but because there, at that specific point in world geography, roughly equal forces met in tense balance. The Euphrates River became more than water flowing between banks. It became a metaphor, the place where Roman power found its natural limit, where the most efficient war machine in the ancient world discovered that efficiency has context, and perhaps, just perhaps, there's something comforting in that. The idea that not everything can be conquered, that the world has its own rules, its own logics, and that even the most powerful have to learn to live within them. Night in the desert is so silent you can hear your own heart beating. Under those same stars that Roman legionaries and Parthian archers saw, the land keeps its lessons, patiently, waiting for someone to learn them. Other impossible frontiers. The story of Rome and Persia isn't unique. In fact, the more you look at world history, the more you notice a pattern. Great empires, powerful and confident, marching into the unknown and finding limits they didn't expect. It's almost as if history were a patient teacher teaching the same lesson in different ways, hoping that eventually humanity will learn it. Let's go back in time to another empire, another place. China, Han Dynasty, approximately the same time Rome was at its height. The Han controlled vast territory, an enormous population, had a sophisticated bureaucracy and a disciplined army. In many ways they were the Rome of the East, And they also looked beyond their borders and saw nomads, tribes of steppe horsemen called Xiongnu. Raiders, the Chinese said, barbarians without civilization. Surely they wouldn't be a real challenge to imperial power. But the Xiongnu, like the Parthians, understood mobility. They attacked quickly, disappeared into the vast plains, refused to fight on Chinese terms. And the Han army, however powerful, simply couldn't catch them. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Chinese response was different from the Roman, but equally revealing. Instead of continuing to try to conquer the nomads, the Han built walls, enormous fortifications of stone and earth that would eventually become the Great Wall of China, a physical admission that there was a limit, a border beyond which imperial control could not practically extend. It was a different solution, but recognized the same reality. Some territories, some peoples, some geographies simply don't fit the imperial model. Now jump forward to the 19th century. The British Empire, on which the sun never set, controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface. They had conquered India, dominated the seas, established colonies on every continent. And then they looked at Afghanistan, mountainous, tribal, without obvious resources that would justify the cost of conquest. But it was strategically positioned between British India and expanding Russia. It couldn't be ignored. 3 times the British tried to conquer Afghanistan. 3 times they failed. Not because they lacked firepower, no, they had it. Not because they lacked numbers or they could mobilize massive armies, but because the mountainous terrain, complex tribal loyalties and simple determination of people defending their land made occupation unsustainable. Afghanistan became known as the graveyard of empires, a title that tragically would prove true repeatedly. The Soviets tried in the 20th century, the Americans in the 21st, always the same result. Initial military victories followed by years of insurgency, gradual exhaustion, and eventual withdrawal. It's almost as if certain geographies were naturally resistant to conquest, not because of some magic or mystical destiny, but for practical, mundane reasons. Mountains are difficult to control, dispersed populations are difficult to govern, deeply rooted cultures are difficult to change, and empires, however powerful, operate with finite resources. Eventually, you have to ask, is it worth the cost? Think of the Teutoburg Forest, year 9 AD. Rome was expanding into Germania. It seemed natural. They already controlled Gaul, why not continue east? The Germanic tribes were divided, technologically inferior. Surely they would be conquered soon. And then, in the dense darkness of the forest, 3 Roman legions, about 20,000 men, were ambushed and annihilated. The commander, Varus, committed suicide. The legion's eagles, the sacred symbols of Roman power, were captured. Emperor Augustus, upon receiving the news, reportedly beat his head against the palace walls, screaming, "Varus, give me back my legions!" But the legions were lost, and with them, Roman ambition to conquer Germania beyond the Rhine. The border was established there, not by strategic choice but by brutal defeat, and it remained there for centuries. The forest, dense and dark, had proven as effective as any army at stopping Roman advance. Is there something about these places, deserts, mountains, forests, that makes them naturally defensive? Or is it more about the combination of geography and the determination of people who call these places home? Probably both. Geography creates logistical challenges, but it's people who transform those challenges into weapons. The Vietnamese did this against the French and then the Americans. Underground tunnels, intimate knowledge of the jungle, patience to fight for decades. A smaller army, poorer, with inferior technology, defeating superpowers simply because it was fighting at home and was willing to pay any price. The Finns did this against the Soviet Union in the Winter War. A tiny country against the Soviet giant. Everyone expected a massacre, and there was a massacre, but of the Soviets. ghostly Finnish skiers gliding through snowy forests, appearing from nowhere, disappearing before the enemy could react. Geography, in this case the brutal cold of Finnish winter, it became an ally, and local knowledge, the will to resist, transformed numerical disadvantage into strategic victory. There's a pattern here, isn't there? It's not that great empires are weak, they're not. It's that power has context. What works in one place doesn't necessarily work in another, and often it's the defender fighting at home who has the real advantage. Rome understood this eventually. Its borders stabilized not where they wanted, but where they could be sustainably defended. The Rhine and Danube to the north, the Sahara to the south, the Euphrates to the east. These weren't arbitrary lines drawn on maps. They were the edges of practical reality. And within those borders, Rome prospered for centuries. Not because it gave up ambitions, but because it learned wisdom. The wisdom of knowing that strength has limits, that not every battle should be fought, that sometimes true skill lies in recognizing what you can't change and living with it. It's a difficult lesson to learn, for individuals, for nations, for empires. Ambition is seductive. The belief that this time will be different is powerful. And so generation after generation, century after century, the same story repeats. A powerful empire looks at a frontier, sees challenge and opportunity, marches with confidence, and encounters reality cold and relentless. Sometimes it learns the lesson, sometimes it doesn't. But the lesson remains, engraved in the mountains, in the deserts, in the forests, waiting patiently to be taught again. The invisible legacy. When we think of ancient empires, we often think of military conquests, battles, generals, conquered territories. But there's another kind of legacy, more subtle, more enduring, the cultural legacy that survives long after political borders disappear. The rivalry between Rome and Persia wasn't just military, it was a centuries-long dialogue between two civilizations. And even when they fought, they were influencing each other in ways they perhaps didn't even realize. Think about silk, that luxurious fabric, light as air, which became a status symbol in Rome. Where did it come from? From China, through the famous Silk Road. But who controlled that route? Persia. They were the intermediaries, the merchants, who connected East and West. Rome paid fortunes for silk, so much that it created a trade balance problem, more gold flowing east than coming in. There were even sumptuary laws trying to limit silk use because it was draining the Roman economy, but they couldn't stop. The demand was too great. And so through silk, spices, precious pigments, an economic connection existed even when armies clashed at the borders. It's fascinating, isn't it? Roman and Persian soldiers killing each other in one place, while elsewhere, Roman and Persian merchants traded peacefully, exchanging goods and, inevitably, ideas. Technology flowed in both directions. Rome learned from the Persians about heavy cavalry. The cataphracts they faced at Carrhae eventually inspired their own armored cavalry units. By the 4th century AD, Rome had its own cataphractarii, a clear admission that the Persian model worked. And Persia? They adopted some Roman siege techniques, fortification engineering. There was mutual respect, even amid hostility. When something worked, pride didn't completely prevent learning. Religion also traveled across this porous border. Christianity, which was born as a Jewish sect in the Roman Empire, spread eastward. Christian communities existed in Persia, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, but always present, and Persian ideas flowed west. Manichaeism, founded by Mani in 3rd century Persia, spread throughout the Roman Empire, profoundly influencing Christian thinkers like Saint Augustine before his conversion. The concept of a universe divided between light and darkness, good and evil in eternal battle. This had Persian roots in Zoroastrianism. Even architecture underwent mutual influence. Roman arches and Persian vaults began to merge into hybrid styles in border zones. Cities like Dura Europos in Syria showed a fascinating mix of Greek, Roman, and Persian elements. Temples next to synagogues next to Christian churches, a cosmopolitanism born from the frontier. Did ordinary people, the merchants, artisans, farmers who lived in these border zones, care as much about imperial rivalry? Or did they simply live their lives, trade with whoever controlled the city at that moment, and adapt? Probably the latter. Empires come and go, but daily life continues. Bread needs to be baked, clothes need to be woven, children need to be raised. And these universal needs create connections that transcend politics. There's a story told about Roman Emperor Justinian and Persian King Khosrow I. They were rivals, of course. Their armies fought multiple wars, but when Greek philosophers were expelled from Athens, it was Khosrow who gave them refuge. And when a plague devastated the Byzantine Empire, killing millions, Khosrow didn't take advantage of the weakness to attack. He waited. There was, curiously, a sense of honor, of unwritten rules even in rivalry. Was this genuine chivalry, or strategic calculation or the understanding that pushing too hard could break the balance and lead to mutual destruction? Perhaps both. Humans are complicated. We can be cruel and noble, pragmatic and idealistic, all at the same time. Persian art influenced Roman art. Those intricate patterns, those representations of paradisiacal gardens, that refined aesthetic you see in late Byzantine mosaics. There's clear Persian influence there. The very word paradise comes from the Persian paradisa, meaning walled garden, and literature. The Persian stories of Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, contain echoes of myths shared with the Greco-Roman world. Heroes with superhuman strength, epic battles, moral questions about duty versus desire. Universal themes expressed in different cultural contexts. Coins are particularly revealing. Roman coins have been found deep in Central Asia. Persian coins have been found in British hoards. Money travels, and with it, images, symbols, ideas about power and authority. There are Persian coins that imitate Roman style, and Roman coins that adopt Persian motifs. A silent conversation through minted metal, each side recognizing and sometimes copying the other. Medicine was also an area of exchange. Greek medical texts were translated into Persian. Knowledge of herbs and treatments flowed in both directions. When wounded soldiers needed treatment, it didn't matter if the knowledge came from Galen in Rome or from Persian physicians. What worked was used. And perhaps that's the most important thing. Beyond imperial rhetoric, beyond battles and propaganda, there was a practical reality. Knowledge is useful regardless of its origin. And pragmatic people use what works. The true legacy of the Roman-Persian frontier isn't who won, because nobody really won. It's that for centuries, two great civilizations coexisted, competed, fought, but also learned from each other. And when both eventually fell, Rome fragmented into successor kingdoms, Persia conquered by the Arabs, much of what they created survived, merged, transformed, passed forward to new civilizations. The Islamic empire that emerged inherited from both Rome and Persia. Its administration was Persian in structure. Its philosophy was Greek and Roman. Its art was a synthesis. And its golden age, and when Baghdad was the center of world learning, was built on foundations that Rome and Persia, consciously or unconsciously, had laid. It's comforting in a way. The idea that even when empires die, knowledge persists. That political borders can be rigid, but ideas are fluid. That humanity, in the end, is better at sharing than dividing, even when it doesn't realize it. The desert sand may have drunk the blood of countless soldiers, but it also carried caravans, bringing silk, spices, stories, and dreams. And in the end, perhaps it's those caravans that matter most. Echoes in the present. There's something strange about studying ancient history. You're reading about events from 2,000 years ago, about people who lived completely different lives from ours, in a world that seemed to operate under totally distinct rules. And then suddenly you recognize something, a pattern, a mistake, a decision that sounds too familiar. It's like looking at a foggy mirror. The image isn't perfect, but you can see contours, shapes, similarities that make you pause and think, wait, this has happened before. When Crassus ignored his officers' advice and marched straight through the desert, confident that Roman superiority would compensate for any tactical disadvantage, he was doing something that leaders have done throughout history, confusing absolute power with applicable power, assuming that because you're strong in general, you'll be strong in any specific situation. How many times do we see this today? Dominant companies in one market that fail completely when entering new territory because they assume the same rules apply. Powerful countries that get involved in conflicts assuming technological superiority will guarantee quick victory, only to discover that terrain, local culture, and determination matter as much as, sometimes more than, firepower. It's not that history's lessons are unknown, they're in all the books. But knowledge and wisdom are different things. Knowledge is knowing that the desert was a trap for Crassus. Wisdom is recognizing when you yourself are marching into a metaphorical desert. And there's something deeply human about pride that makes this wisdom difficult to achieve. Nobody wants to be the leader who retreated, who admitted that maybe this specific conquest isn't worth the cost. There's pressure, internal and external, to demonstrate strength, not to appear weak, to keep pushing even when the quiet voice of reason whispers that you should stop. Crassus felt this. The Roman emperors who came after him felt this, and modern leaders feel this too. The difference is only scale and technology, not fundamental psychology. Think about how Rome and Persia spent centuries in a seemingly endless cycle of war and temporary peace. Both sides knew that neither could really destroy the other. The most experienced officers, the wisest strategists on both sides, probably understood they were trapped in a pattern that consumed enormous resources without producing decisive victory. And yet they continued, because stopping would mean admitting all the previous war had been in vain. Because there was always the temptation to think that this time, with this general, with this strategy, there would be the decisive breakthrough. Because frankly, the war machine has its own momentum. Military bureaucracies, economies built around conflict, political identities defined by external enemies. Sound familiar in the context of certain modern conflicts, wars that begin with clear objectives but gradually transform into something more nebulous, maintained by inertia as much as purpose? The point isn't to judge. It's easy to look at the past and see mistakes with perfect clarity. The challenge is recognizing similar patterns when you're living inside them, when you don't have the luxury of historical perspective, when immediate pressures cloud long-term vision. Rome eventually learned to live with its borders, not because they gave up being powerful, but because they redirected that energy. Instead of spending infinite resources trying to push beyond the Euphrates, they strengthened what they already had, built incredible roads, aqueducts, legal systems, a culture that would last much longer than their legions. And perhaps there's something there about where to put energy. Constant expansion looks impressive on paper, but consolidation, internal building, making sustainable what you already have, that's less glamorous but often more enduring. Companies discover this. Explosive growth without solid foundation leads to collapse. Countries discover this. Empires that expand too quickly fragment. The challenge is knowing when to shift from expansion to consolidation, when the next territory isn't worth the effort. And then there's the question of understanding context. Rome was brilliant in the Mediterranean. Its strategies, its logistics, its entire empire model was perfectly adapted to that environment. But when they tried to apply the same model to the Mesopotamian desert, they discovered that context matters immensely. You see this in so many areas. Solutions that work brilliantly in one cultural environment and fail completely in another. Technologies that revolutionize one market and are irrelevant in another. Not from lack of quality, but because the context is different. The temptation is always to assume that what works for you will work everywhere. But the world is stubbornly diverse, and that diversity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It makes the world more resilient, more interesting, more capable of surviving shocks. Rome and Persia, for all their rivalry, created something unexpected, a border that became an exchange zone. Merchants who didn't care much about imperial politics, ideas that flowed in both directions, a cultural synthesis that enriched both sides even as their armies fought. Today, in a theoretically much more connected world, we still struggle with this. Borders, physical, cultural, ideological, still exist. And there's still the tension between competition and cooperation, between seeing the other side as enemy or as potential partner. There's no easy answer. There never is. But the story of Rome and Persia suggests that even bitter rivals can coexist, can learn from each other, and that sometimes the space between empires, the frontier, the grey zone, is where the most interesting things happen. Crassus is buried somewhere in the sands of Mesopotamia over 2,000 years ago. His legions disappeared. The empire he served transformed beyond recognition and eventually fell. But the lesson remains, engraved not in stone, but in repeating patterns. Ambition without wisdom is dangerous. Power without context is limited. And borders, whether they're rivers, mountains, or more abstract limits, exist not because the world is cruel, but because it's complex. And complexity demands humility. The wind still blows through the ruins of Carrhae. The stars still shine over the desert. And somewhere, someone is making a decision about business, about politics, about life that echoes decisions made millennia ago. Maybe this time they'll do differently. Maybe they'll recognize the desert before marching into it. Maybe they'll ask not just if they can conquer, but if they should. Maybe they'll see the border not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a reality to be respected. Or maybe not. Maybe the lesson needs to be learned again the hard way, as it always has been. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the echoes. When borders disappear, there's a peculiar moment at the end of any great rivalry, when the protagonists realize, too late, that they were so focused on each other that they lost sight of the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, as always, kept moving. Rome and Persia, at the beginning of the 7th century, were exhausted. The war that began in 602 AD had dragged on for more than 2 decades. Cities burned, fields devastated, imperial treasuries emptied, entire generations of young people lost in campaigns that led nowhere. In 628, when they finally signed peace, both sides essentially returned to pre-war borders. 26 years of suffering for nothing. Just to prove, once again, that neither could really conquer the other. There must have been a deep weariness at that moment, not just physical but spiritual. The feeling that all this struggle, all this destruction, was fundamentally futile, that they were trapped in a pattern they didn't know how to break, but they didn't even have time to process it. Because while they fought, something was happening to the south in the Arabian Peninsula, something neither empire was paying attention to. A merchant in Mecca had begun preaching a new faith, monotheistic, like Judaism and Christianity, but with its own revelation, its own scriptures, and this message was spreading, not just as religion, but as a political, social, military movement. When the Prophet Muhammad died in 632, his successors looked north and saw two staggering giants. Rome and Persia bled by centuries of mutual war, with poorly defended borders, with populations tired of taxes and endless conflicts, and they realized this was the moment. The Arab armies that emerged from the peninsula weren't large. They didn't have the military sophistication of Rome or Persia, but they had something more powerful: unity of purpose, incredible mobility, and, crucially, they were fighting against exhausted enemies. In 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, a smaller Arab army defeated a much larger Byzantine force, not through technological superiority, but through tactics that recalled, ironically, the Parthians themselves. Mobility, knowledge of desert terrain, refusal to fight on the enemy's terms. For the Byzantines, it must have been like a nightmare echoing through the centuries. Carrhae again, but worse. Because this time, it wasn't just a lost battle, it was the beginning of the end of their presence in the Middle East and Persia. The Sassanid Empire, which had resisted Rome for 4 centuries, which had captured Roman emperors and sacked Jerusalem, collapsed in less than 2 decades. The Battle of Nahavand in 642 broke the spine of the Persian army, and with it, the will to resist. It's hard not to feel a strange sadness about this. These two empires, with all their achievements, their rich cultures, their ancient traditions, consumed so quickly. Not because they were weak in absolute terms, but because they had exhausted themselves fighting each other. If they had cooperated instead of competed, if they had formed an alliance, divided Mesopotamia into spheres of influence, focused on external threats instead of mutual destruction, history could have been completely different. But that's speculation. What happened, happened. And what happened was that the border that defined the world for centuries simply disappeared. Not gradually, but in a historical blink of an eye. In 650, a boy born in Rome and one born in Persia would have grown up in completely different worlds, separated by a border that seemed eternal. In 700, their grandchildren could have grown up under the same caliphate, praying in the same mosques, speaking Arabic in addition to their native languages. Borders that seemed permanent proved temporary. Rivalries that seemed eternal ended abruptly. What seemed impossible to change changed with surprising speed. And what does this say about borders in general? About the divisions we consider permanent, inevitable, natural? Perhaps that they're more fluid than we think. That what seems solid is actually sustained by forces in delicate balance. And when that balance shifts, when context changes, barriers that seemed insurmountable can disappear almost overnight. Think of the Cold War. For decades, the world was divided between East and West, an ideological border that seemed as solid as any geographical line. And then, in a few years, in the late 1980s, that border simply evaporated. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly the world was different. Or think about technology. There were clear boundaries between different industries: telephony, computing, entertainment, retail, separate sectors with their own rules. And then smartphones and the internet made these boundaries almost irrelevant. Suddenly everyone was competing in every market. The most rigid borders are often the ones that exist in our minds, the assumptions about how the world works, about what's possible or impossible, about who we are and who others are. And these mental borders can be the hardest to cross, but also the most important. The story of Rome and Persia isn't just about two empires, it's about how we see limits, how we decide what's achievable and what isn't, how we define borders and how they, in turn, define us. Crassus believed there was no real border in the East, that Rome could go as far as it wanted, and he was wrong in a catastrophic way, but the emperors who came after and accepted the Euphrates border were also, in a way, limiting possibilities. They chose stability over expansion, pragmatism over ambition. There's no universal right answer. Sometimes accepting limits is wisdom. Sometimes it's premature surrender. Sometimes challenging borders leads to disaster. Sometimes it leads to revolutionary breakthroughs. The secret, if there is one, is perhaps discernment. Knowing the difference between a real border and an imaginary one. Between a limit that should be respected and one that should be challenged. Between prudence and cowardice. Between courage and madness. And how do you develop this discernment? Perhaps by listening. Listening to advice, as Crassus should have. Listening to the land as the Persians did. Listening to history, to the lessons of those who tried before and what they learned. Perhaps also through humility. Recognizing that you don't know everything, that your perspective is limited, that the world is too complex to be reduced to simple formulas or absolute certainties. The border between Rome and Persia was real. Geography, logistics, culture, all of this created a genuine barrier. But it was also, in part, a construction. Maintained by choices, by priorities, by identities that both sides had embraced. And when a new power arrived with different priorities, different identities, different choices, the border simply stopped making sense and disappeared. Perhaps the lesson isn't that borders are illusions, but that they're contingent. They depend on context, and context changes. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but always inevitably. The sun rises over the desert every morning, just as it rose when Crassus's legionaries marched to their death, just as it rose when Arab armies swept two empires from the map. The sand is still there, the stars still shine, but the borders, those are written in water, not stone. And water, eventually, always finds new paths. The wisdom of the sands. And so we come to the end of this journey through time and sand. From the moment Crassus, full of ambition, marched into the desert, to the moment when the very border he tried to cross disappeared, swallowed by a new world order. It's a long story, this one. Centuries of conflict, of temporary triumphs and permanent defeats, of empires rising and falling like tides, and at the center of it all, a simple question. Why can some limits be crossed and others not? The answer, as we discovered, isn't simple. Because limits aren't just lines on maps. They're the sum of geography, culture, technology, human will, and perhaps most importantly, context. What's impossible in one moment can become inevitable in another. What seems permanent can prove transitory. Rome never conquered Persia, not because it didn't try, not because it lacked power, but because the kind of power it had wasn't suited to the kind of challenge Persia represented, and because Persia, in turn, never managed to break Rome. They were, in a way, perfectly balanced in their opposition, strong enough not to be defeated, but not strong enough to win. And there's something almost beautiful in that balance. For centuries, these two worlds coexisted. They fought, yes, but they also traded, learned from each other, influenced one another. The border between them was real, but it was also permeable. Ideas crossed where armies couldn't. When we think about borders today, perhaps it's worth remembering this, that barriers can be solid in some aspects and fluid in others, that what can't be conquered by force can be transformed through exchange. That rival doesn't need to mean absolute enemy, and that competition can coexist with cooperation. The tragedy of Carrhae wasn't just the thousands of lives lost on that hot May day. It was the illusion that led Crassus there. the belief that will and power were enough, that local knowledge and respect for terrain were optional. He learned too late that the world doesn't bend just because you want it to. But Rome, as a civilization, eventually absorbed this lesson, not immediately, not perfectly, but over generations through trial and error, through defeats that hurt and victories that taught. Rome learned to respect its limits, and within those limits built something enduring. Perhaps that's the real wisdom. Not that we should always accept limits without questioning, but that we should understand them. Distinguish between barriers that should be torn down and limits that exist for good reasons, between healthy ambition and destructive arrogance. And how do we do this? How do we know the difference? There's no magic formula, but there are principles. Listen to those who know the terrain. Respect complexity. Recognize that brute force is rarely enough, that strategy matters, that context is everything, and above all, maintain enough humility to admit when we're wrong. History doesn't give us definitive answers, but it offers us patterns, precedents, lessons bought with blood and time. If we pay attention, if we're humble enough to learn from the past, instead of assuming this time will be different, we can avoid repeating the same mistakes. And sometimes, the most important lesson is knowing when to stop, when to recognize you've gone far enough, that adding more territory doesn't bring more strength, just more vulnerability. That unlimited expansion doesn't lead to greatness, but to overload. What a journey, right? If you enjoyed traveling with us through these stories of frontiers and empires, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflections, share them in the comments. Rome lasted 1,000 years in the West, over 1,000 in the East, not because it was invincible, but because it was adaptable, because it learned when to retreat, when to strengthen, when to simply maintain what it had. This pragmatic wisdom, this ability to live with limits instead of fighting blindly against them, may have been its greatest strength. And Persia, in its various forms, also lasted millennia, not as a continuous empire, but as a civilization, as culture, as identity that survived conquests and transformations. Because some things are deeper than political borders, more enduring than empires. Today, the sands still cover the bones of those who died in that battle so long ago. The wind still blows through the ruins of cities that were once great. And the night in the desert is still cold and clear. The stars still shine with that ancient light. But for those who listen, for those who pay attention, there are voices in that silence. Not literal, of course, but echoes of lessons learned hard, whispers of wisdom bought with suffering, gentle reminders that history matters, that patterns repeat, and that perhaps, just perhaps, we can be a little wiser than those who came before. Not much wiser. Humans are still humans. We still have ambition, pride, the temptation to believe we're different, that the rules don't apply to us. But a little wiser already helps. A little more humility already prevents some disasters. A little more respect for what we don't understand already saves some lives, and perhaps in the end, that's what it's all about. Not about never making mistakes, but about making less catastrophic ones. Not about being perfect, but about being a little better. About learning slowly and painfully that the world is complex, that power has limits, and that some borders exist not to limit us, but to teach us. Rome's journey to the Persian frontier was long and costly, but it left us something valuable, an understanding that not everything can be conquered, that civilizations can coexist without one completely absorbing the other, that borders, even those impossible to cross, can be bridges for exchange as much as barriers to advance. When you look at the map today, you don't see Rome or Parthia anymore. You don't see the Sassanid Empire or Byzantium. Those borders disappeared, but the lands are still there. People still live their lives, and the lessons, those remain, written not in stone, but in humanity's collective memory. Impossible frontiers, limits that can't be crossed. Or perhaps limits that teach us more by resisting than if they yielded easily. Silent teachers, patient, waiting for us to finally learn what they have to teach. And as you rest, as sleep comes gentle and soft, perhaps it's worth taking this thought with you. That true strength isn't in breaking all barriers, but in knowing which to break and which to respect. That wisdom isn't doing everything possible, but understanding what's sensible. That greatness isn't measured only in conquests, but in sustainability, in legacy, in endurance. The desert at night is silent. The sand cold to the touch, the stars infinitely distant but still visible, and somewhere in that vastness the lessons of Carrhae sleep, patiently waiting for another generation to discover them. Sleep well, and tomorrow, when the sun rises again, perhaps we'll see our own frontiers with slightly wiser eyes, a little more humble, a little more prepared to live in the world as it is, not just as we'd like it to be. Good night.